United States President Donald Trump is currently preparing negotiations between Putin and Zelensky. Donald Trump is trying everywhere to organize negotiations between the Ukrainian and Russian presidents. After all, the deadline that the United States President gave Putin to reach a peace agreement with Ukraine expires this week. And so, for this purpose, Trump is sending his envoy Steve Vitkov to Moscow and General Keith Kellogg to Kyiv. Moreover, both special envoys will be in the two capitals at the same time and will clearly coordinate the preparation of negotiations between Moscow and Kyiv remotely. By the way, the Kremlin has already confirmed Vitkov's meeting with Putin and stated that the Russian dictator is ready for direct negotiations with Zelensky. But as always, they have set new conditions. Nevertheless, Washington is hinting that the negotiations may be indirect, similar to the talks between Israel and Hamas. That's exactly why Vitkov and Kellogg will be in Moscow and Kyiv at the same time. Although the entire process of preparing for negotiations is currently being hindered by the positions of China and India, who are not yet publicly rushing to stop buying Russian oil, even despite Trump's threats to impose 100% tariffs. Well, that's exactly what Trump's main bet was in putting pressure on the Kremlin. So in this episode, we'll discuss with you all this behind-the-scenes preparation for the negotiations, what it could lead to, and how it might all look. I'm Alexei Pechi. It's August 4th. Let's review everything step by step. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, leave any comment you want, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So, at this very moment, Donald Trump's team is actively working on trying to organize indirect negotiations between Putin and Zelensky. United States President Donald Trump confirmed that his special envoy Steve Vitkov will travel to Russia this week. During a conversation with journalists, Trump said that Vitkov might visit Russia on Wednesday or Thursday. Moreover, according to Trump, it was the Russians who requested Vitkov's visit before the end of Trump's 10-day deadline for Putin. Next is a quote from Trump. Vitkov might go, I think, next week on Wednesday or Thursday, he might go to Russia. They would like to see him. They asked for him to meet with them, and we'll see what happens. Trump also repeated again that if Russia does not agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine by the deadline, he will impose sanctions. However, he noted that the Russians have learned well how to bypass these sanctions. Quote, "There will be sanctions, but it seems they avoid sanctions quite well. You know, they're crafty characters, and they avoid sanctions quite well." So let's see what happens. In response to a question about what Steve Vitkov's message to Russians would be, and whether they can still avoid sanctions, Trump said that it is necessary to make a deal that will stop people from dying. He reminded that recently data was released about huge losses among Russian soldiers, as well as thousands of, unfortunately, dead Ukrainians. Let me remind you, Trump announced Steve Vitkov's visit to Moscow as early as last week. At the same time, United States Ambassador to NATO Matt Whitaker stated that this visit could bring certain results that would bring the end of the war in Ukraine closer. It is important to note that this Friday marks the end of Donald Trump's 10-day deadline for Putin to reach a peace agreement. And now Vitkov's visit on July 6 or 7, well, that really says a lot. At the same time, it became known today that United States President Donald Trump's special envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, will come to Kiev again in the coming days. This visit will take place against the backdrop of the deadline set by the American leader for reaching a peace agreement, that is, by August 8. And as you understand, the news about Keith Kellogg's upcoming trip to Kiev coincides with the planned trip to Moscow by another Trump envoy, Steve Vitkov. And so, as sources in Washington reported, Vitkov's trip was proposed by the Russians and was approved despite Donald Trump's initial skepticism. According to the interlocutors, the United States president told his advisors that he considered this trip useless. Nevertheless, he still sent Vitkov to Moscow. At the same time, against the backdrop of Donald Trump's ultimatum about a ceasefire in Ukraine, the Kremlin started talking about the possibility of a meeting between the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. In particular, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said today, and I quote, "Putin is ready to meet with Zelensky after preparatory work at the expert level." At the same time, he emphasized that the preparatory work for a meeting between Putin and Zelensky has not yet been done. However, the Kremlin does not rule out the possibility of a meeting between Putin and Trump's special representative, Steve Vitkov, in Moscow this week. By the way, a week ago, Zelensky reported progress from the Russian side regarding his possible meeting with the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. At the same time, the Kremlin stated that a meeting between Putin and Zelensky is unlikely to take place before the end of August. In addition, Ukraine's ambassador to Turkey, Nariman Dzheliao, said that Russia sees the logic of preparing for a meeting between Ukrainian President Zelensky and the Russian dictator Putin quite differently than the Ukrainian side does. Therefore, as they say, it would be foolish to expect that a meeting between Zelensky and Putin will take place in the coming days. But here, a slightly different trend can be observed. And here I want to remind you how that same Steve Vitkov organized negotiations between Israel and Hamas. Both sides have never held direct negotiations, but there was always an American mediator between the negotiating groups from both sides. Later, the mediators were Egyptians or Qataris. But the essence of the negotiations always came down to the fact that the American side conducted a dialogue with Israel and Hamas separately, and later combined these positions into a single conclusion. If necessary, the American delegation could pass messages to the other side that were voiced by the other party. Now we see that Vitkov and Kellogg will be in Moscow and Kyiv at the same time, and it would be ridiculous to call this a coincidence. It's obvious that the Americans might try to conduct those very indirect negotiations between the office of the President of Ukraine and the Kremlin. During such negotiations, all these organizational aspects of a possible future meeting between Putin and Zelensky can be discussed, if it even seems realistic at all. I wouldn't be surprised if Kit Kellogg and Steve Vitkov are constantly in touch when they're in Moscow and Kyiv to relay various messages. And I didn't mention the Ukrainian ambassador to Turkey earlier for nothing. So today Nariman Dzheliao stated that Turkey is primarily protecting its own interests. Therefore, we shouldn't expect that it will suddenly change its position and put pressure on Russia during peace negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. However, there are certain advantages to such a neutral position. Next is his quote, "Turkey understands everything perfectly, perhaps in their own way. Our task is to convey our position to them and explain certain points, but we must be realistic. Turkey, first and foremost, protects its own interests, so we shouldn't have unrealistic expectations of it. As for its neutrality in the negotiation process, they are still fully performing the role of facilitator. It is precisely the balance between supporting Ukraine's sovereignty on one hand and not openly pressuring Russia on the other that allows Turkey to serve as a negotiation platform. The European countries, which almost fully support Ukraine, are no longer seen by Russia as a possible platform for diplomatic negotiations. Turkey, thanks to its position, sometimes taking a step toward Ukraine, sometimes a step toward the Russians, has gained the opportunity to be such a platform. This is important for everyone, including us. Sooner or later, we will need to come to an agreement, and for that, communication is necessary. In general, Turkey has already been practically designated as the venue for negotiations between Putin and Zelensky, if it comes to that. But here a problem arises in the form of India and China, because both countries are still refusing to comply with Donald Trump's demands to stop buying Russian oil. United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, after negotiations with the Chinese, stated, "The Chinese take their sovereignty very seriously. We do not want to interfere." That's why they would prefer to pay a 100% tariff. Well, it's a hint that they will continue to buy Russian oil. Bessent also called his colleagues from China tough negotiators, although, according to him, their resistance does not hinder the dialogue between the countries, and there is every chance of reaching a trade deal. But there are already signs that Trump is ready to make concessions to China if they help force Putin to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. As for India, Washington continues to put pressure on New Delhi, and there are already the first signs that India will eventually back down. I won't go into detail here about India and China because there are already separate episodes on this topic on my YouTube channel. If you're interested, go check them out. In general, this issue is still up in the air, and it's possible that both countries, India and China, are just waiting for this deadline to end to see how serious Trump really is. So basically, everyone is just stalling for time. But the simultaneous visit of Steve Vitkov to Moscow and Kita Kellogg to Kiev is a very interesting episode that we need to watch very closely. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.